She wore hand-me-downs to school on purpose. She rode the back of the bus and pretended her lunch was just a snack. Everyone thought it was posture, a performance. No one imagined why. The bell rang like a verdict that morning, metallic and unforgiving, and the polished floors reflected her small figure as she moved through a sea of backpacks and polite whispers. A paper slid across her desk with a red 0 glaring at the top, sharp as a stamp. Olivia Hartman was 17, the oldest daughter of a man whose name opened doors. And every time a teacher handed back a test, she felt as if the world had folded in on her. Her hands smelled faintly of lemon from the kitchen, her heart hammered like a distant drum, and she kept her face a practiced calm so that the laughter around her would not find its target. She folded the test slowly, eyes skimming the lines of red as if reading a language she did not know, and tucked it into a thin folder she had labeled Invisible. Across the hallway, a quiet figure watched with patient, tired eyes. Mr. Reyes, the night custodian who had a way of hearing what others ignored, observed how she slid the folder into her book as if hiding a secret. He walked on, his keyring jingling like a small chorus, and left a seed that neither Olivia nor the school expected would root. Her life at home looked like a postcard. The Hartman house was glass and stone, a model of curated ease. In the mornings, the entry smelled of citrus polish and brewed coffee, and the suitcases were packed neatly in the foyer when she left for school. Her father, Daniel Hartman, moved through the rooms in a cadence of whispers and decisions, the weight of the company in his voice, and the house hummed with staff and quiet rituals. But inside those clean rooms, Olivia kept a box of paper scraps where she sketched inventions and scribbled questions she was too afraid to ask aloud. The pressure of expectation sat at the table with them, a silent guest. On weekends, there were charity galas and poses for photographers, applause that felt hollow against the soft sound of her pencil on napkins during the ride home. Her mother, Claire, sent gentle reminders over text that read like press releases, and the household manager, Marta, kept schedules tight as clockwork. In public, she was Hartman, effortless and composed. In private, she was a puzzle of ideas with nowhere to fit them into the formal grid of honors classes and standardized tests. The more she tried to perform the role, the less the exams allowed her inner logic to breathe. She hid the panic in neat cardigans and rehearsed smiles, and the contradiction between appearance and reality became a constant ache. Her childhood, in fact, had begun in a smaller town where curiosity was celebrated rather than controlled. When she was a child, Olivia collected broken radios and took them apart on the porch while the neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, brought lemonade and stories. She learned early that things could be remade, that gears and wires had a grammar she could learn by touch. In middle school, she moved with her family to the city, and the grammar shifted. The new schools measured intelligence in boxes and times, not in tinkering. She learned to translate her curiosity into footnotes, and the language lost its flavor. Teachers praised her for polish and missed the spark she tried to tuck away. That gap widened into a quiet shame as her parents' world insisted on polished scores and presentations. Her father pushed syllabi and tutors, believing that resources could engineer results. Her mother taught her posture and palate. Alone at night, Olivia returned to the porch memory and wondered if the way she saw things could be taught into a form that would pass the tests. The seed of that question would lie dormant until someone unexpected gave her a map. The day of the math test had been ordinary in its light and ordinary in its small cruelties. The classroom smelled of chalk dust and lemon hand soap, the hum of fluorescent lights above like a constant tide, and the shuffle of papers sounded like tiny avalanches. Miss Carter, who wore small silver earrings and a voice that did not shout, moved down the rows distributing papers. She placed Olivia's test on the desk as if setting down a small verdict and kept walking. Olivia felt old enough to have learned to accept humiliation, to fold it into her posture. She opened the paper and touched the flaking edge of the red mark, as if assessing whether it would crumble. Nearby, Maya and Jason exchanged looks that spoke of a rumor being born. The teacher returned to the front and called out names in a measured tone. The 0 looked like a symbol from another life, and Olivia slid it back into the folder titled Invisible. Miss Carter paused, glanced at her, and for a fraction of a second something passed through the teacher's face that might have been curiosity or pity. The corridor outside carried the metallic clang of the older building, the scent of rain that had been tracked in by students, and the chatter of lockers. Olivia folded her shoulders into their accustomed smallness and walked on. The humiliation at home arrived as a quiet accusation. Daniel Hartman set the test on the dining table with the careful impatience of someone whose name was used as a standard. He placed his coffee cup down in a soft circle on the wood. The room lit differently on that afternoon. Sunlight caught the edges of the painting above the mantel and flattened the sounds into a slow, calibrated hum. He looked at the red zero and then at his daughter, measuring her as he always had. "Olivia," he said. Voice, "This is not like you." She folded her hands on her lap, the fabric of her sleeve rough under her fingers, and tried to explain in small, drafted sentences that made sense on paper but fell apart in the room. "I am trying," she said. "I study with the tutors you hired. I do the practice tests." Her words tasted of metal and apology. He tapped the paper, the sound clicking like a metronome. "We give you everything. Name it, and we will fix it," he offered, more announcement than question. She wanted to say that the fixes he imagined did not touch the way her mind drew lines in space, did not understand that the tests wanted her to fit into boxes that were not built for her thought. Instead, she said nothing and retreated into silence. The silence between them felt like a tribunal. At the edge of the schoolyard, where the hedges smelled of wet earth and the janitor's shed kept the tools of unnoticed labor, Olivia first saw Mr. Reyes differently. He was 55, with a back that bent from years of lifting and hands that held tiny calluses like credentials. He had the quiet face of someone who had learned to listen by polishing floors at night, and his uniform smelled of oil and lemon cleaner. One afternoon, he stooped to pick up a note Olivia had dropped and found sketches of gears and diagrams for a small lamp she imagined could purify water. He studied the pages as if reading a map, then looked up and chuckled softly. "You hide good things well," he said, handing the paper back. His voice had a grain to it, like sandpaper worn into comfort. Olivia looked at him, surprised at how easily she could meet his gaze. "I pretend," she confessed. "I pretend I don't have what I have." He sat on the low curb and took off his cap, fingers worrying the brim. The sun warmed the pavement, and a distant engine rolled like an undertow. "Why?" he asked simply. She touched the folded edge of an idea and breathed out, "Because if they know, they will expect different things. I am not sure I can be different for them." He nodded, as if this explained everything, then leaned in and said, "Maybe you just need a way to show them what you already know. Not to change who you are, but to give your thoughts a shape." That night, he left her a small thing on her desk at school, a worn notebook with the cover taped where it had split, and on the first page he had written one sentence in block letters: "Break the problem into parts." Their first real conversation about method unfolded in the library between stacks that smelled of dust and old glue, under a light that hummed like a steady lamp. This is the scene where lessons began to look like inventions. Olivia sat across from Mr. Reyes at a table where the varnish was nicked and the chair squeaked when she shifted. He had brought an assortment of small objects from his job: a broken clock, a rubber band, a scrap of wiring. He placed them between them as if laying out props for a simple question. "Show me how you think," he said. "Tell me what you see." She took a breath, tasted the paper and dust, and began talking. She described a mental map where a problem was a machine with cogs that did not fit. He listened, humming occasionally, his hands folded. Dialogue blossomed into a slow exercise, each exchange a small calibration. "When you read a test problem, what do you do first?" he asked. "I read the words and then imagine a picture," she answered. "What picture?" he prodded. "Sometimes a diagram, sometimes a story," she said. "Then where do you get stuck?" he asked. "Translating the picture into the words they want," she said. "So," he replied, "we will practice translation." He suggested a routine of 5-minute sketches, 3-sentence summaries, and 1-line labeled goal before solving a problem. He showed her how to anchor a question with a first sentence and a small diagram, how to reframe an essay prompt into a map. The smell of lemon polish in the air from his jacket mingled with the dust of books. By the end of that first session, she had written and erased and written again, fingers smudged with graphite, the paper taking shape like a map of a new city. The room settled around them, and she felt for the first time that something like method could be taught by someone who had not gone to the school she attended but had learned by doing. The mentorship that followed was practical and stubborn, a series of small experiments designed to translate her creativity into testable steps. Each meeting began with a ritual. He would set down a battered timer he had found in a trash bin, its face scratched, and they would set a tiny, fierce goal. The session smelled of coffee grounds and oil, of the lemon from his coat, and the tactile feel of eraser shavings filled the space between sentences. They worked in 5-part cycles: observe, draw, label, plan, execute. He taught her how to read a question as if it were a machine schematic. He taught her to annotate passages like a mechanic annotates blueprints. He taught her to speak her solution out loud to an imaginary audience of gears. In the cafeteria, he would ask her to explain a concept to Maya or Jason as if they were a curious child. She practiced presenting ideas in 3 short sentences and watched the way their faces softened. The first measurable change was small. On a pop quiz, she earned a 65 instead of the zeros that had become her signature. The paper had smudges where she had drawn a diagram, and the teacher's margin note said, "Getting there." The feeling in her chest when she read that note was like the first warm breath after holding under cold water for too long. The class began to look at her, not with amusement, but with an odd interest, a recalibration that felt like the world shifting a gear. At about the moment her scores crept upward, the narrative asked the audience to participate. The video would pause and ask this: "Did you ever have someone who believed in you when everyone else counted you out?" Pause and answer in the comments with a single word and a name. The request was simple and direct. It invited memory and made room for connection. People were asked to begin their reply with "My mentor was," and to keep it short, because short answers open doors for others to enter the room. The call to respond was a small ritual of community that echoed the small rituals Mr. Reyes and Olivia practiced. It validated that few things are solitary in their power. The pause filled the air like breath held and released. Then the story moved on. The progress brought its own new kinds of tension. The first major moment of public challenge came in a school assembly where Olivia was asked to present a project she had helped design, a small lamp that purified water in stages. The auditorium smelled of waxed wood and perfume, the lights were bright and invasive, and the sound system hummed with a thin electrical complaint. A crowd gathered, and her name felt heavy as a headline. Maya, Jason, Priya, and Chloe sat in the 3rd row, their faces a mixture of pride and disbelief. Daniel Hartman was in the audience, leaning back as if this was a charity exercise he had scheduled into his calendar. And Miss Carter watched from the side with a slightly surprised expression. She stood at the podium, palms damp, and began to speak. A boy in the back laughed. Someone murmured that this was a stunt. The auditorium tilted between applause and skepticism. Olivia's voice rose into the mics. She showed the diagram that had once only existed on napkins and explained in 3 concise steps what the device did. The room listened. The laughter shrank. The applause at the end sounded like a small repair in a long broken thing. The victory was visible and small but real in its measurement. The principal, Mr. Patel, invited her to participate in a local science fair. But progress made other people anxious. Daniel Hartman interpreted the attention as a problem in control. He called Olivia into his study, where the house smelled of old leather and citrus, the skyline of the city a distant silver. He asked her how this had started and who had guided her. She told him about Mr. Reyes and the method, and for the first time she saw in his face a map of concern that read, like fear for reputation. "He is not one of our people," he said quietly, the words sharp because they were not shouted. "I never questioned you, Olivia. I want to make sure no one takes advantage of you." She felt small and adult at the same time. "I am not being used," she said. "I am learning." He asked if she wanted to be defined by his name or by her ability to solve her own problems. The room smelled of lemon and old books, and the light seemed to flatten every word. They argued in quiet turns, each sentence a measured exchange. He offered to pay for more tutors, to enroll her in special programs, to find experts with glossy credentials. She listened and felt a new tension, the one where love and control braided together. She asked for a moment and stepped out into the cool air of the terrace, the city wind scouring the taste of old arguments from her mouth. Her choice would be a hinge. The confrontation between father and mentor that followed was an inevitable scene of cultural and moral friction. Daniel arranged to meet Mr. Reyes in the school office, a room with institutional carpet and the smell of paper. Mr. Reyes arrived with his usual slow step and a cup of coffee that steamed faintly in his hand. He greeted the principal and Daniel with a nod that was both respectful and unassuming. The conversation began in measured tones. Daniel's questions were precise. Who taught her? What methods were you using? Did you have permission to work with her? Mr. Reyes answered simply, his sentences like tools well used. "I saw a mind like ours cannot waste," he said. Daniel's voice rose slightly at the implication that a man of his station might be insufficient. "You need to understand we can provide any resource," he insisted. Mr. Reyes looked at him and said, "You provide resources that buy things. I taught her how to divide a problem into parts so her head could breathe." The room grew still. The principal, Mr. Patel, shifted in his chair. Daniel pushed a stack of letters across the desk, proposals for structured programs and paid tutoring, an attempt to formalize the help. Mr. Reyes set his coffee down and said, "She did not need this. She needed someone to show her how to name the pieces." Daniel asked sharply if Mr. Reyes wanted compensation. Mr. Reyes smiled, small and resolute, and said, "No. I have been paid in full by this school for 20 years. The payment I accept is seeing a young person find her way." The exchange was a study in values. Olivia stood in the doorway, feeling like a hinge between two worlds, and watched as two orders of authority negotiated what it meant to help. The final stretch of the story was a record of slow, measurable change. More tests, more diagrams, more three-sentence summaries. The improvement charted itself like a steady number climbing: 65, 72, 81. Teachers who once wrote off her papers began to underline different things, to ask her to explain how she arrived at a solution. Miss Carter offered a small smile and the note, "This is growth." Maya and Jason, who had mocked at first, started to ask Olivia to tutor them in ways of thinking that had nothing to do with grades and everything to do with clarity. The community at school began to reframe her identity. Daniel, watching the numbers, softened in parts and remained rigid in others. But he attended the science fair and stood in a corner as Olivia explained her work to curious strangers. His face a mixture of parental pride and the new discomfort of seeing his daughter's value not solely tied to his name. The school recognized Mr. Reyes at a small assembly, offering him a certificate for service, which he accepted with a handshake and a careful bow, his eyes finding Olivia in the crowd. 3 moments of real tension remained to be told, each a test of resolve. The first was when a scholarship committee asked for a letter of recommendation, and Daniel insisted on writing it himself, in terms that read like a resume rather than a human endorsement. Olivia asked to write her own narrative, and the committee paused, uncertain. She wrote about failure and attempt, and the letter was honest in a way that money could not polish. The second happened when a rumor began that Mr. Reyes had overstepped boundaries, an ugly whisper that wound its way through the PTA. It took conversations with the principal, with counselors like Mrs. Gomez, and with neighbors like Mrs. Alvarez to dispel malice with facts. Truth triumphed through patient testimony. The third came when Olivia was offered a place at a competitive university and had to choose whether to take a scholarship for merit or a program that prioritized community projects. She chose the latter, sensing that her work with Mr. Reyes had changed not only her grades, but the way she wanted to help others. Each moment stretched her like a string, learning a new pitch, until the note she produced was steady. A month later, the changes were domestic and practical. Olivia had routines: 10 minutes of sketching every morning, 5-minute oral summaries before bed, and a weekly session with Mr. Reyes where they discussed not only problems but failures as material for learning. The school published a small article about her project in the local paper, and a neighbor from the old neighborhood called to congratulate her. Daniel and Claire attended a community talk where Olivia presented a plan for a small workshop to teach basic design thinking to younger students. The workshop took place in a gym that smelled of rubber and dust, with folding tables and fluorescent lights, and 10 kids showed up with wide, hopeful faces. Olivia taught them how to break a problem into parts, how to sketch a single diagram, and how to speak about an idea in 3 sentences. Her voice in that gym was steady. The first month was full of small rituals that kept her anchored: a morning walk with the dog where she practiced summaries aloud, a weekly supper where the family turned off devices and spoke. She kept the notebook Mr. Reyes had given her in her backpack, its pages filling with small triumphs and corrections. 3 months later, the seeds had begun to alter community perception. The science fair piece opened opportunities for a partnership between the school and a local nonprofit. Olivia and Mr. Reyes co-led a weekend workshop that attracted teachers and parents who wanted to learn the same method. The workshop smelled of chalk and coffee, and the sound of children laughing as they built makeshift models. Mr. Patel wrote an op-ed praising community mentorship, and local media interviewed Olivia, framing her story not as a miracle but a model of consistent practice and modest guidance. The school instituted a pilot mentorship program that connected students with staff members like custodians and cafeteria workers who had skills to teach. Daniel Hartman, invited to speak at a donor event, spoke about the unexpected power of listening, and his remarks felt less like a lecture and more like a confession of growth. Olivia's grades had climbed into the high 80s in several classes, and her confidence had settled into a calm that did not require performance. 6 months later, the legacy began to take shape. The pilot mentorship program gained funding, and a small scholarship fund was set up in Olivia's name to support students with unconventional talents. The scholarship criteria included not only grades, but demonstrated ability to apply creative problem-solving to community projects. Mr. Reyes received an invitation to speak at the teachers' meeting, and he accepted, telling the story of a girl who learned to put her thoughts into boxes that tests could recognize without losing their shape. The neighborhood watched as a community that had once whispered began to applaud aloud. Olivia organized monthly workshops at the community center where she taught design basics and invited students and staff to collaborate. The workshops produced small inventions: water filters, low-cost lamps, and a pamphlet that taught 5-minute translation techniques for test questions. The school changed in small, practical ways. Teachers reserved time for visual mapping in exams, counselors incorporated routine sketching into study plans, and a small plaque in the library honored the idea that mentorship can come from anywhere. In the end, the lesson was quiet but concrete. Olivia was no longer the girl who folded failures into her purse. She was a young woman who learned that failure was not a verdict but a step. Her father learned that resources are not the same as understanding, and that sometimes the most useful education comes from people who see and listen more than they announce. Mr. Reyes returned to his nights of work, his hands as worn as ever, but with a new kind of recognition from the school community. The secret he offered was not a formula that fit every test, but a method to translate thought into form, to break a problem into parts and tackle each with patience. The community learned to look differently at those who work quietly in the margins. If you were touched by this story, share a name in the comments of someone who believed in you when no one else did, and write one short sentence about what they taught you. Your small answer could be the kind of seed that changes a conversation in a school, in a home, or in a life. Remember, it is not failure, it is attempt, and sometimes the greatest wealth is the faith someone places in you.